In digital media today, data is simultaneously one of your biggest growth opportunities and also one of your biggest sources of anxiety. Most executives would rather focus on building products, shipping features, or growing revenue than dealing with privacy regulations, consent frameworks, and AI governance. And so, what often happens is avoidance. We'll deal with it later, we'll fix it when legal flags it, or we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But the problem is that bridge is already here. And increasingly, companies are finding out the hard way that data practices don't just create compliance risk, they also quietly cap growth, slow innovation, and undermine trust. And so today, to unpack this properly, I'm really pleased to be joined by Devan Brua. Devan is the founder and CEO of PrivacyWise, where she works with companies on a range of different issues. She works with startups to public firms to help them build practical, business-friendly approaches to privacy, data governance, and AI, not as a box-checking exercise, but as a competitive advantage. Devan and I have worked together over the last few months on a new diagnostic tool in the space we may get to later. But I want to talk to her more broadly about the mistakes, the mindsets, and the maturity curve that companies go through as they try to get data right and why this matters now. Devan, I'm really glad we were able to make this conversation happen today.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me.
I'm really glad to have this happen. Before we get into the common pitfalls, I want to ground this in a real-world example that you sent over to me a few weeks ago. You pointed out an enforcement action by the California privacy regulator against a marketing company, ROR Partners, for failing to register as a data broker. Can you give me a bit more context on what happened there and why cases like this are such a big deal for companies that rely on data?
The ROR Partners situation is really interesting because this time it wasn't about a data breach or intentionally bad behavior or the types of infractions that you usually hear regulators going after. This was simply about their classification and the fact that they didn't register as a data broker. California, Cal Privacy, they determined that they were a data broker because they were a marketing firm using billions of data points to build consumer profiles, covering all sorts of demographics, socioeconomic, and behavioral information on millions of Americans, primarily in the wellness space. They marketed to wellness companies and wellness brands, and they would create custom audience segments and provide those to wellness brands for targeted advertising as part of their services. They packaged those audience segments into their services. And what happened was Cal Privacy said, that's a sale. You've probably heard a lot of people talk about what is a sell or share of data. And this is it. That was a sale. It doesn't matter that it was bundled as part of their services. The regulators determined it was a sale. Therefore, they were essentially acting as a data broker. And what makes this a really big deal for a lot of companies is that many marketing, ad tech, and other data-driven companies, they assume that they're just acting as service providers. A lot of companies in the B2B space deal with large amounts of data and assume that they're acting as service providers to their clients. But regulators are increasingly looking at what they do with that data, how they package the data, and how they share it, not only with their customers, but with other third parties. And they're saying a sale is a sale, and you can't bypass these requirements by packaging the information you're selling as part of your products or services.
When you first made me aware of it, it scared the hell out of me, and I'm sure it scares that type of example. I mean, you'd point to a very isolated example, but it is indicative of a series of concerns that I think executives need to be aware of in this space right now. You and I have worked together on and off now for a number of months, but even though we've been meeting regularly and building tools and frameworks in the space, I don't think I actually know how you got into the data and privacy and governance space, or what pulled you into this space in the first place.
It's the same cliche answer that many privacy professionals have, especially here in the US, and it's GDPR. I was working as in-house counsel at a software company here in Colorado when GDPR passed in 2016. At that time in my role, I was already responsible for a number of other compliance requirements within the company. And so when GDPR passed, they said, here, you deal with it. And it landed on my desk just by default. What became really clear to me when that happened was that privacy isn't just a legal problem. And it's actually not even just a compliance problem in terms of meeting the requirements. It's a cross-functional operational problem that many companies are expecting their legal departments to handle and solve alone. I would get pulled in after product teams had already built features, after sales teams had already made commitments to customers, after engineering had integrated new third-party services. And my job was to make it compliant, which really meant figuring out how to retrofit the things we were already doing into decisions that have already been made, and then have those fit the privacy regulations. And it just wasn't working. It was very frustrating because the same problems were repeating themselves in different ways as new regulations passed, as new states passed regulations. My product teams didn't know what questions to ask. Engineering teams didn't know what vendors they needed to flag. Sales didn't know what commitments they could make or not make that created liability for the company. And what I realized over the next several years of learning GDPR was that the companies who did compliance well weren't the ones with the best lawyers or the biggest budgets or the biggest teams. They were the ones who had figured out how to integrate their compliance obligations into how they actually operated. What that generally looks like is cross-functional collaboration across the company. No more operating in silos. No more just saying, I'm marketing, I'm going to go do my thing. I'm product, I'm going to go do my thing. But really making sure people were talking to each other. And so that the issues that were coming up, whether it's, data compliance or some other kind of legal or IP compliance, making sure those issues were flagged early. And then the discussion could be had without slowing growth.
Got it. So given that you've now worked in the space for so many years and you've worked with many different companies, what's the most common single mistake that you see that organizations make when it comes to data and privacy?
They don't actually understand their own data flows. They have a general idea. Yeah, they have a general idea of what data they have and where it's coming in from. But in reality, there are so many points of entry for data, especially for those companies now engaging in online retail or online advertising. In addition to their normal everyday functions, you've got the standard employee data, HR data coming into your company. But you've also, I work with a lot of tech companies, you've also got a lot of information on individuals, on consumers coming in through your website, your applications, and sometimes even your product itself. And so in those cases, a lot of times the organizations, they don't understand all the different types of data that are coming in. They don't understand where it's going, who's touching it, who has access to it, how is it reused, can it be reused, when is it deleted, is it ever deleted? I mean, these are a lot of questions that need to be answered. And if companies do undertake these exercises, which I do see some do at the advice of consultants, like when building a new project or something, they will do it as a one-time project instead of treating it as this ongoing discipline that you really need to be on top of. And that's why I keep going back to it's a cross-functional problem. It needs to be across the entire organization as a process and that's built into how companies think about what they're doing and how they're moving forward.
So given, just while you've been talking, I've sort of a question I actually hadn't intended to ask you, but given what you're saying about the need to understand the flows, most lawyers, or I shouldn't generalize it, many lawyers don't have technical skills to be able to go that deep on the data flows. Is that why you say it needs to be cross-functional? Or do you think that also there is a need for companies to develop that skill set within the legal team so that they can go that deep?
Two things. One is, yes, that's why I say it needs to be cross-functional at a minimum. It needs to be cross-functional. And two, that's why I started my company, because it often does fall on the legal teams. All of these issues have real legal ramifications to the organizations. But the legal teams don't typically have the technical expertise, or more importantly, the bandwidth to deal with a lot of the stuff on a day-to-day basis, like it needs to be dealt with. And so when I was leaving the corporate world to do something on my own, I thought, how can I provide value? And the way I wanted to provide value was doing just that, giving legal teams more bandwidth by providing that operational cross-functional piece that they could plug into their organization and help build this out so that everyone's communicating more effectively.
Got it. So I'm going to ask you a quick, you are the expert here. I've been dangerously close to, particularly at some of my time at Yahoo, when I got close to the privacy and data governance world. But a phrase that I hear increasingly is that compliance shouldn't be treated as a box checking exercise. In practice, what does that mean if we're talking about companies moving from a compliance mindset to being, I assume, a more strategic data mindset? When I hear that phrase, how should I think about it?
Yeah, I mean, box checking is what it sounds like. You know, it's a checklist, it's box checking, it's paperwork, and people hate it. It's bureaucratic. People think of it as something that slows growth. And so the principle I try to follow and the way I try to implement compliance and especially data governance across organizations is to move away from here's a list of the requirements and here's a list of what you do and let's check the boxes, but to see how you can meet the organization where they're at and use the tools, processes, meetings that already exist to cover off on those compliances so that it's not becoming a box checking exercise. And also because then it's more connected within the business. When it's embedded into how everything's done and how decisions are made, everything changes because it's not about having rules for the sake of rules. It starts about being about clarity. It provides individuals within the organization a bigger stake in protecting the organization from anything going wrong. It enables people to have conversations earlier and sooner, you know, even just at the water cooler. Hey, I'm working on this. And then all of a sudden you have a brief chat and it brings up issues that you realize you have to talk about in the future and start planning around. And so when everyone in the organization, not just leadership, has a real picture of the risk, the consequences, the trade-offs, the mitigations, and when they're all on the same team trying to achieve the same goal, it becomes cross-functional organizations become able to make decisions faster, smarter, with more confidence. And so that's why I say it can aid and enable growth instead of slow growth, because it really makes you able to move faster.
Okay. So on that same theme, that if a company's not sort of just checking the box, if they're trying to continuously improve and continuously try to understand all of the risks, there must be some kind of maturity curve for companies where there are some that are sort of just starting out, they're early stage, they don't have the right practices in place, they get more mature. How should I think about what companies need to do as they start to scale their business, and where do they get stuck on that maturity matrix?
Yeah, it all comes down to silos, operational silos. If you have product team A working on their product and product team B working on their product, plus legal, plus accounting, plus finance, all the things that, you know, come into play interconnected in an organization, marketing on top of it, sales on top of it. If you have everyone operating in a silo and they're not talking to each other, things are gonna go wrong. And so what I see with immature organizations is, teams that don't even know who the legal department is, teams that don't even know who to ask, teams where they've never connected and never really had those communications, and those bridges being built to understand that this is one company that needs to all work together. And so the more silos within a company, the less mature the data governance is going to be.
Let me push you a little bit more on this, because it must be about more than just the silos. There must be also a capability that needs to get developed in key functions. I'm assuming you can't just hire the one privacy lawyer or the one data lawyer, and you can't just have one data scientist to pull the data. How should companies think about where they need to prioritize their hiring and how big these teams need to get? Have you any thoughts there?
That really depends on the organization. You can do a lot with a small team. What I tend to find works the best in organizations of any size, before you go to hiring specific individuals, because again, that can make things even more siloed, is building those cross-functional teams. And so what we've built at different organizations is things like data governance champions committee, where every department sends one person over for a meeting once a month, led by who's ever in charge of data governance compliance, whether it's legal, whether it's a compliance team, whoever it is. And, they talk about, here's the issues, here's what we see, here's what came up this month as an issue. And here's what's coming on the future. And do you have any questions? And does anything you're working on in your day-to-day come up as a flag of something we should be thinking about? And so it's those types of things, champions committees, regular meetings with leadership where someone on the team knows what questions to be asking and what should be talked about, training programs, all those kind of things. That's really what companies need to invest in up front before they bring in a specific person.
Got it. I want to get to a question informed by some of the work that we've been doing together. When companies come to you and say, we think we're doing okay on our data, what are the areas that most often diverge from reality, or at least their perception? Where do perception and reality most often diverge in terms of their understanding of their data organization?
Consistency and scalability. They have policies, they've bought tools, they've put up cookie banners, they're doing the things, and that is real effort. It's not nothing, but it's the consistency and scalability. You can't just throw up a cookie banner and then never look at it again. You have to make sure it's working. You have to make sure it's working properly, and you have to understand what data is coming in, and that the technical requirements behind those things, they change more than you would think with, different engagements with different marketing firms and different ways of collecting advertising. People are dropping pixels or cookies, onto websites, and then suddenly you're collecting different things than you said you were at the outset. Same thing with products. Some of my clients make real products that are sold to consumers that collect data. And it starts out as product A and it's great. And then someone on the product team has an idea, and a little subset of a team flies off to go explore that idea. And as they're building that idea, they start using all the data that the company already has, because it's their data. So why shouldn't they be able to use it? But did the company get the proper consent? A lot of times those questions, people move without asking those questions. And again, making sure that everyone within the organization is on the same page, asking the same questions, understanding the same amounts of risk, can stop some of these problems before they start. And so again, companies treat it like a check the box exercise. Companies treat it like a one and done exercise, but data ecosystems don't stand still. Products evolve, teams change, new vendors get added, new use cases emerge every single day. So without consistent, regular, cross-functional communication, the changes happen in silos and companies aren't able to scale accordingly.
Okay. So one of the reasons that we worked together to build the Edge Diagnostic tool along with Greg McDonald over at Chelsea is to give teams a fast, structured way to assess where they stand across consent, collection, governance, monetization. From your perspective, why is a diagnostic approach like this more effective than jumping straight to, say, policies, tools, doing repeated audits?
Because a lot of times people have the idea of there's a problem and I'm just going to buy something to fix it. Let's throw money at the problem and buy a solution, buy a tool and fix it. But in reality, there's a lot more to consider. There's risk questions to consider. Maybe you're throwing a lot of money at a very low risk problem. A diagnostic flips that order. Instead of starting with what should we buy or what should we do, it starts with what is actually happening today within our organization, where are we intending to go in the future, and then you can truly start looking at what you might need to do for a solution.
Okay.
Every next step will become more effective because your policies will be grounded in how data actually flows. The tools that you select will match instead of just trying to fit a problem that you don't actually have or that doesn't match your structure. And audits become validation exercises instead of painful discoveries.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. So a lot of executives hear privacy and they understandably think costs and constraints. Can you give an example of how stronger data practices can actually enable growth rather than slow it down?
Yeah, stronger data practices allow organizations to simply make decisions much faster. That's it. No one is guessing. Teams aren't defaulting to no. The legal department isn't saying no for everything because they're all afraid. You can move forward with confidence when you understand what you have. And I saw very clear examples of this at some bigger SaaS companies, some bigger platform companies, where they make a platform that engages with consumers every day. And when the teams are aligned and they understand the risk levels, where the risk lies, and what they can and cannot do, and when they feel like they have the support of leadership and the support of legal and the support of marketing and everyone behind them when it comes to the product, they're not only not afraid to share information and be excited about what they're working on, but they're also not afraid to move forward because they know they've got a team behind them, an organization behind them that's all operating on the same principles, and it's gonna mitigate the risks even more. And so I've seen it really allow product launches to go faster, allow sales deals to close faster. Everything moves faster when everyone's on the same page.
Because they have the confidence that the guardrails they know they can operate within, that they can operate quickly within those guardrails. Yeah. As you look over the next few years ahead with AI, evolving regulation, increased scrutiny, what do you think companies will look back on and say, we underestimated that?
I think they're going to look back and say they underestimated how foundational a strong data governance program was from the outset. Not privacy, not AI, but data governance from the beginning. And that goes back to knowing and understanding your data flows, what you're collecting and why, how is it coming in? Do you actually need it? What are you doing with it? What can you do with it? All of those questions. I think a lot of companies weren't really asking those questions. I think data maps and data inventories are a relatively newer concept that, came into play with information security, obviously, first of all, keeping that information secure, but the linkages between them, where it's flowing and how it's flowing, that really came into play with privacy and now with AI governance. And you just can't separate it out.
Got it. Devon, this has been incredibly helpful. Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspective with me and with the audience. If people want to learn more about your work and what you're doing at PrivacyWise, what is the best way for them to contact you?
Yeah, they can find me or PrivacyWise on LinkedIn. And we also have our website, privacywise.tech.
Excellent. Thank you. I am James Deaker. I am the Yield Doctor. Thank you for watching.